saved for posterity, put on YouTube. So
Neat. Is it? She's into doing that right now. Is that her? Was that on Facebook or on? Where'd you see it, Joe?
See if they're, we'll start in about 30 seconds, see if anybody else is gonna plug in. See my other computer so I can introduce Paige, so. Okay, I guess we'll get started. Welcome to our meeting. This is our January meeting. Yet another one via Zoom. Who knows when we'll be able to meet live, but hopefully someday. Just one quick announcement that I have. Thank you to Brooke Widmar, Susan Hazelwood, and Boyd Terry for agreeing to be our nomination committee. So they'll be accepting nominations. There'll be something in the chat on how to apply if you wish to run. We have one board position that needs to be filled, and that's a 3-year board term. So there'll be something in the February chat about that. So, but that's all I have. So I guess we'll get started. Paige Witek works for the Missouri River Bird Observatory. She became the education coordinator in 2018 after working as a seasonal educator. She's a native of Green Bay, Wisconsin, so I guess she's pretty happy about the Packers. And she graduated from the University of Wisconsin in Madison in 2016 with a bachelor's degree in zoology and a certificate in environmental studies. Paige's passion for conservation, birds, and environmental education has been obvious to Columbia Audubon members who have watched her lead bird banding sessions during our annual Band with Nature program. She really enjoys doing that with the kids. I can vouch for that. And she did a really good job too on the Saw-Whet Owl banding project too with Dana and Ethan. She has worked with zoos, wildlife rehabilitation and education centers, wildlife sanctuaries, and studied in Queensland, Australia. At MRBO, she is working to expand the Young Explorers Club and the Missouri Young Birders Club, which she launched in 2017 and 2018, respectively. Tonight, she's going to help us take a closer look at grassland birds and the work that MRBO is doing on behalf of these vulnerable species. So with that, I will turn it over to Paige.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Jim. I had no idea you knew so much about me. No, yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I'm really excited to speak to all of you today. So my plan for us, I'm going to talk to you about grassland birds, mostly about what MRBO does for grassland birds and why protecting their habitats is so important, as well as I'll go over some birds that are more specific to grasslands. And if there might be, looking at some of these faces, there might be a bit of information that many of you already know, but I do encourage that when I get to the bird, like just going over the bird parts, like feel free to put in the chat, like any tips you have for IDing those birds, or if you have a really fun story about them, or anything like that. Because yeah, we can be interactive about that, particularly for the bird part. I mean, we're just talking about cool birds, so I prefer it that way. And I know we have a lot of awesome knowledge in this Zoom room space. But let me get started. So I'm gonna share my screen here. And first, I'm just gonna talk a little bit about MRBO in case you aren't familiar with us. Come on. All right. So in short, our mission, we're working to contribute to the conservation of Missouri's birds and their habitats through research and monitoring, education and outreach, and advocacy. So our work, if you really want to kind of boil that down to what that really looks like, we focus on these 4 what we call eggs. You could think of it as like what we want these things to hatch and become reality. So we work towards providing quality habitats for birds. Feeding the flock refers to sustainable agriculture. And bird-friendly communities refers to things like preventing window collisions and planting native plants and things like that. And people in nature is probably one of the things that I, in my job, work most towards, which is getting people out and learning about and appreciating nature. If you're curious to learn more about MRBO, which is our acronym, you can visit mrbo.org. And there's a lot of information there about the organization and what we do. So talking about grasslands specifically. So I just want to start out with, and a lot of you probably already know this, but with a little bit of grassland appreciation. So at least for me, even before moving to Missouri, even as someone who is really into nature, when I thought about a grassland, like the first image that popped into my head was more of just like a field. But I think all of us know that the real true beauty, or what I discovered for myself at least, the real true beauty in a grassland is when you take the chance to look a little bit closer. And when you look closer, you notice this amazing abundance of insect diversity, a crazy amount of plant diversity within a very small area. And then you notice things like ornate box turtles that you almost step on and things like that. And of course, the wonderful bird life that lives there as well. So why does MRBO work on grasslands? Well, a lot of you may be familiar with, it's one of our most like imperiled habitats in Missouri. So these maps provided by the Missouri Prairie Foundation show the amount of prairie in the past, and then the very little remnant prairie we have today. And so we have less than 1% of our original grasslands or prairies in Missouri. And so, you know, that alone is a really vital important to protect these and learn more about the wildlife that inhabits this habitat. Also, many of you may have heard of the study that came out in 2019 in September in the journal Science that let us know that wild bird populations in the US and Canada have declined by almost 30% since 1970. So almost 2.9 billion birds lost in 50 years. And this was, I think, really hard news for a lot of us. And we saw devastating losses in birds in almost every biome. However, I think it is important to note some bright spots. So they also saw inclines in waterfowl populations, so increases in population of those, as well as raptors, which I think shows that when we invest in these creatures and we really put all of our efforts toward conserving them, it works. And so we can see increases in those areas. I also think it's really important to note that some of the data used for this study was collected from annual surveys that Columbia Audubon participates in, and radar, so new technologies, and also things like Christmas bird count data and eBird data, and all of that, those community science projects that really contribute to these long-term studies like this in a really important way. So what we're doing does matter. And so, like I said, there were these losses in almost every, all these different types of habitats, with 53% loss in grassland birds. So one of the steepest declines in this very important habitat that we have here in Missouri. And so to lift us up a little bit more even, so what does the Missouri River Bird Observatory do? So when I think about our Grasslands project, I think of it in kind of two parts. And it's quite possible that Dana and Ethan view it quite differently than I do, but this is how I think about it, which are these grassland surveys that are like population monitoring, and our grassland nest monitoring project, which is looking at the effects of nest success over time. And I'll explain both of those a little bit more. So grassland surveys consist of they start about mid-May and they go about to the end of June. And then again, we do fall migration surveys on Wakanta and Linscomb prairies from about September to mid-November. And these are population monitoring. And what that looks like is a field tech putting on their chaps because they're going through some rough prairie sometimes, lots of thorns out there. And they're collecting data and typically using an iPad or a phone. If you're curious to know details about how like all that technology works, you can ask Ethan. But essentially they're going out there and they're following these transect lines. And they're recording all the birds that they're seeing and hearing along that transect line. And so not to overwhelm you with this picture, but this is kind of what that might look like at the end. And I forget what habitat this is from, but it looks like somewhere in Cedar County, so probably Wakanta. But all these red lines that you see, so those are the transect lines where the technicians are walking. And they are approximately 40 meters on length on average. And then those blue lines that you see are 10-meter increments away from that transect line, just to help give the technicians like kind of distance, help better, how do I phrase this? Just as a way to kind of help manage like distance, like from plotting from where they see how far away they see the bird to where to plot it on their iPad. And then these transect lines are approximately 200 meters apart. And so you see, and then they start to plot and you can see that these transect lines cover most of the landscape. And so you're getting a good idea of which birds are inhabiting what parts of the landscape. And a lot of land managers keep track of where they're doing their certain management things within the landscape. So we can get a better idea of what the bird populations are looking at when we implement certain land management techniques. So we can learn a lot more about the birds and the effect that that land management has on the birds that inhabit that landscape. I don't know if I said that in a very straightforward way, but I think you'll get the picture. So it can be really important and really interesting too, to see some of this stuff as you look at it in more of a closer scope. So moving on to the grassland nest research and monitoring. So this is a project that I tend to talk about a little bit more because I can often show pictures of baby birds, which are really cute. So this project has going on about since 2016, and they've been conducting nest monitoring studies on Taborville in 2016, 2018, and 2019. And on Wakanta prairies in 2017 and 2019, as well as 2020. And they're monitoring this study occurs to test the effects of patch burn grazing, the land management technique on nest success. So there are two types of units in the study, a treatment unit and a control unit. And the treatment unit typically has grazers present during the season, while the control unit does not have grazers present. In addition, each unit typically has approximately 1/3 of its area burned every year. So therefore, for the purpose of the study, nests are categorized as either being in the treatment unit or the control unit. And this study takes place kind of May until the end of July is when they're monitoring these nests. So first, I just kind of wanted to show all of you these videos because I think particularly when I talk to kids and I go there like, well, where did the birds nest on a grassland? And I say, oh, they nest on the ground. And they make this kind of cup nest. I think they go, well, the idea is like, well, how hard would that be to find, you know, like for predators or for us, even as we're trying to study these nests? And the answer is very, very difficult. So Eric took these videos that I think are good at showing just how like difficult it can be to see that nest, even as you're walking right past it. Or if you're me, you're walking right past it. So this first one, I believe, is a Henslow sparrow nest. Never see it. So you can see, yeah, just how like kind of hidden that is. Okay, and so this next one I believe is a grasshopper sparrow nest, and these are kind of neat too because you can kind of see a little bit of a difference in the vegetation between these two nests and where they like to put their nests. So that second one is like, to me, a little bit less hidden, but still like, you got to have an eye to be able to see that as you're walking by. And so there are techniques that the technicians use to try to find these different nests that we're monitoring. So one is called rope dragging, which is that picture that you see on the right, or this picture right here on the screen. So the two field technicians have a long rope with, you can barely see it in this picture, but kind of strings of cans all along it. And the idea is that as they're walking, that creates a much bigger area that you can cover to try to flush up the bird off the nest. Because like you saw in those videos, seeing the parent bird fly off the nest is pretty much the best way to try to find these in those thick landscapes. I have done rope dragging, and I will say that it's exhausting. Simply walking through the prairie can be very tiring enough. Trying to drag up a long rope through the prairie is also quite difficult. So I prop the field technicians for doing that multiple days because I did it once and I'm not keen to do it again. Another technique that they use is using a highly technical piece of equipment, just like the rope, of a stick or a long pole to kind of just increase your radius as you kind of walk through the grassland, kind of brushing it out in front of you to try to flush up a bird to see, and then check that area for any possible nest. So what we're kind of looking for are successful versus unsuccessful nests. And Dana just put in the chat something, hold on. Oh yeah, so the rope is not dragged along the ground. It does not disturb the nests. Yeah, that's a really good point, Dana. But yeah, it's just like, yeah, kind of the sounds that cause that bird to kind of flush up, but no birds are harmed in our techniques. That would be very important to us, that doesn't happen. And so so what they're looking for are just these birds first at this egg laying stage, counting how many eggs are in there. And then of course, approximately every 3 days is how often they're checking the nests. And that varies depending on species and the nest, what stage they're in within the nesting cycle. But then you're of course looking for, I just wanted to show you some cool pictures of bird nests that Eric has taken over the years. So looking at these different birds as they're hatching. And then of course, as they're nestlings and they start to grow in those new little feathers and begging for food. And then once they fledge, that would be considered the successful nest. And these are my favorite pictures when Eric sends me these and they're like, look, this bird fledged. And it's one, happy because they fledged out of the nest, but also They look like they're little cute little cells with their new feathers and they're like little tufts. So when we're measuring successful nests, a successful nest is one that laid eggs, or made the nest first, laid eggs, hatched, raised the nestlings, and fledged out of the nest. And a nest would be considered unsuccessful for a variety of different reasons. So maybe that nest got predated by a snake or a glass lizard, which I believe is what's in this picture. Maybe it was weather, so dramatic changes in weather can have a huge impact on nests and the parent birds. Parasites or brood parasitism by brown-headed cowbirds can also be a reason a nest is unsuccessful. So just to give you a brief idea of results. So if you're really interested in looking at our grassland nest monitoring project information, I would talk to Eric or look at one of our reports. This is just meant to kind of give you an idea of like what we're looking at or what we'll possibly be looking at. So some of these different nests that were found, and you may find it interesting, like Bell's Vireo is one of the ones that they find the most, which Eric thinks is just kind of due to the nature of the nest. It's more of a pendulum nest, so it's not as hidden there on the ground. With the second highest nest being found being field sparrows. I think that's quite interesting. And again, so like some of them are just better hidden, and some of them, like eastern meadowlarks, are just like really hard. Their behavior around their nest is really hard to track where exactly their nest might even be. And then looking at these success and failure in these different control and treatment units and comparing them. And the study has not been going on long enough, and we don't have quite the amount of data to draw any sort of conclusions yet, but it is kind of interesting just to look at year by year as we get more and more data to see what happens. And I believe this is also not updated data that is on this slide either. But we're also, looking at parasitism rate in these different species and how often that they get parasitized by brown-headed cowbirds as well. So there's a lot of different things that we can learn from both of these projects. And so the more we can learn, the better we can help these grassland birds. So now is a little bit more of a relaxed and can be a little bit more of an interactive part of the presentation. So I'm just gonna go over some grassland birds that are some of my favorites. Share some fun facts and give some tips to identify. And like I said at the beginning, if you have any like really good tips that I don't mention, please feel free to put them in the chat. Or if you're just like, oh my gosh, I love that bird, or me too, or whatever, feel free to use your reactions or anything like that. And we can make this a little bit more interactive because I know a lot of you know these birds and probably love them as well. So I think one of the first ones that I think of when I think of a prairie or an open grassland is the eastern meadowlark, or meadowlark in general. In winter, you might find westerns out here more too. So they're here year round. And it doesn't really feel like spring until you're driving down the highway and you hear their nice little song as well. And what's interesting is the eastern meadowlark male can sing several different variations of its song. And in New York, the songs from one male were analyzed using spectrograms, which is like that visual image of a bird, of a sound. And the bird sang in this analyzation of this one male's singing, he sang more than 100 different patterns of his song, which I think is super interesting. And so the birds themselves will sing from fence posts and telephone lines. So that's a great place to look for them. They'll stalk through grasses, probing on the ground for insects with their long, sharp bills. And on the ground, they're quite camouflaged with kind of that field looking upper parts. But when you see them perched up on perches, they have that bright yellow underparts and like a striking color to them and that little bit of black on their throat. So really cool birds. Next, can't talk about grasslands in the summertime without talking about Dickcissels, which is also one of our like target species of our grassland project. And it's interesting to think about. So they're here in Missouri during the summertime. But it's interesting to say, like, in preparation for fall migration, Dickcissels will assemble into larger and larger flocks that can reach into the thousands. And it said, and I've never seen this, but it said on their wintering grounds that these flocks can number in the millions of birds. And for me, I'm sure they're more subdued in the winter, but for me, thinking about the kind of like loud singing Dickcissel, conspicuous Dickcissel, and millions of them flock together is kind of like overwhelming for me to think about, but it's really cool. And so their song sounds like their name. Well, supposedly, I don't really think it doesn't really sound like that to me, but that's what other people say. He's kind of chunky, and he's kind of like a miniature meadowlark with that black V on a yellow chest, but they have that thick seed-eating bill and really kind of more rufous kind of on this wing here in their upper parts. Bell's Vireo, this is also a really cool grassland bird. So again, here during the summertime, and they're quite small, and they of course have that Vireo bill, but slightly thicker than a warbler's, but quite small for a Vireo bill really, which is that longer upper mandible with that little bit of that hook at the end. They're pretty gray overall, and they have two pretty pale wing bars, with the upper one a little bit less distinct than the lower one, and their flanks have that little bit of yellow wash to them. And fun fact about these birds that I have not witnessed myself, but I have heard that the pair of Bell's Vireos sometimes forage together during the breeding season, moving upward through the branches in a spiral, gleaning insects from the vegetation. So I just think that's kind of cute and cool. Next bird, Northern Harrier, which I think is one of my favorite birds just overall. And it's such a joy to see them now in the wintertime. You can see, if you go out to grassland, you're probably going to see one, or at least a really open area, a large open area. And I think part of what I think is so cool about them is they're really the most owl-like of hawks, though they're not related to owls. So because they rely on hearing as well as vision to capture their prey, and that disc-shaped face looks and functions much like an owl's, with those stiff facial feathers helping to direct sound to the ears. And they're pretty distinctive even from a long distance away. So they have like a slim, long tail. They glide low over the marsh or grassland. They kind of hold their wings in a V shape. And they have, and you can't really see it on this picture, but they have that white patch at the base of their tail. And then up close, you can see that more owlish face. And the one pictured here is either a juvenile or a female, but the males, of course, are more gray and white compared to this larger, or this more brown and tan color. Really cool. I'm sure you knew I was going to mention this one, the short-eared owl. Awesome. And I think one fun fact about them is that they're normally pretty reluctant to leave their nest. So of course they're here in the wintertime, but farther up north where they nest, the female, it takes, it's going to take a while for them to flush off the nest. But once they do, the females do flush off, they'll defecate on their eggs. And that smell, and the thought is that the resulting smell may repel predators or mask the scent of the nest. And I don't know if you've ever smelled owl poop, but I have while working with birds and wildlife rehab, and it doesn't smell nice. It would definitely deter me if I was a predator. Yeah, these owls, these pictures are, probably taken closer to either dawn or dusk. So that's when you can see them. And I wouldn't look for those short ears. They're usually not visible. They're unique to owls in that they have a little bit of a different like hunting behavior. So most owls, I would say, are more like sit and wait predators, and a short-eared owl has a more active way of hunting where they're kind of like a harrier, really like flying over the grasslands as in search of prey. But you will see them perched sometimes as well. And yeah, they just kind of have their kind of that same like owl-like posture and face, and kind of a pattern in those yellow eyes and that kind of white face. Yeah, and they're really fun to see when you're out there. It's really exciting. So Henslow sparrow. So I think this is one of those sparrows that is the opposite of what you may think of when a lot of people think of a sparrow, which is like these little brown birds. But Henslow sparrow, I think, are really cool, like a really great example of when you look closer at sparrows, how many different colors you can really see. In this picture is really great, kind of showing that yellowish on the face and that little bit almost like orange on their wing and on their back. And they're here during the summertime, and they're also a huge target species for our grassland projects. It's always exciting when we see a Henslow sparrow, and it's extra exciting when we find a Henslow sparrow nest. And they have a very simple and short song that that David Sibley has described as a feeble hiccup. It barely sounds like a song. And so it's just really fun to see these birds out there when you do. So next I have the bobolink, which, it can be a little bit harder to see as they really only breed kind of farther north in Missouri. And they have a pretty long migration route. But I think that's one of the really cool things. I always like to bring up the bobolink because there's just so many cool things about them, from their like robotic sounding call or song to they're just a really impressive migrant, traveling around 12,500 miles to and from South America every year. So this is only really half their range map. So if we were to look at more of a full one, that they're spending their winter down in South America there. And it said that throughout their lifetime, it may travel the equivalent of 4 to 5 times around the circumference of the earth. So quite the traveler they are. And what I think is the coolest thing about them, but there are a lot of cool things, is that they can orient themselves with the Earth's magnetic field thanks to iron oxide bristles in their nasal cavity. And in tissues around their olfactory bulb and nerve. So they essentially have this internal compass in their nose that lets them know which direction they're going in coordination with the Earth's magnetic field. So I just think that's super cool to be able to help them navigate. But they also use the starry night sky, as do a lot of other birds. And other birds use the magnetic field as well. But I just think that's really cool. So this is, of course, the male pictured here, and then your female looks a little bit different, but same shape and size overall. She's just gonna look a little bit more sparrowy, I guess. She's got that more brown streakiness to her. And the juveniles, and sorry, I just said female, but that's also non-breeding plumage. Scissor-tailed Flycatcher. So these are pretty hard to miss when you see them because they have that crazy long tail, and you can often see them on fence wires or telephone poles sometimes, or electric or power poles, and they'll typically perch in the open, and yeah, those long forked tails are an unmistakable silhouette, and it actually can have some use to it too, as they you catch insects on the wing, and that kind of gives them a little bit more steering with those sharp twists and turns. And so we'll see them kind of in the warmer months. Sedge Wren. I think wrens are some of my favorite groups of birds, and the Sedge Wren is also just really cool as a bird. So here more during, I guess, breeding and migration time, I would say. So, and what's interesting is they're described as a small secretive wren that breeds in short grass and sedge marshes. But I've also had the experience of sitting on a quail count, a quail covey count, and just kind of sitting really still. And like, they're kind of curious as well, kind of coming up to you too. So they're known as one of the most nomadic territorial birds in North America. So on any given area, it may be present in numbers one year and be completely absent the next. So a lot of their territory and stuff is still being studied, and we're still kind of figuring it out. So again, small wren, look for it in this habitat. And last but not least, because I don't want to take up too much of the time, I want to leave some time for discussion and questions. But the last one I'm gonna talk about is the Upland Sandpiper. I think these birds have a lot of personality. I haven't been able to see them a lot in my life, but when I do, they're pretty conspicuous. And I don't know, I just think they kind of have a lot of personality to them. And unlike most other North American shorebirds, you don't see them on wetlands. You see them more on these grasslands, hunting grasshoppers and other insects. And they'll often perch on fence posts, like you see this one doing here during the breeding season. And they can be a pretty decent indicator species of some good quality habitat as well. And they're also that long distance migrating all the way down to South America in the wintertime. So any bird that travels that far is really cool to me. But upland sandpipers are extra awesome. But I've said that about almost every bird on this presentation, so I don't know. But so that is kind of the end of my super formal grassland birds presentation, and we can maybe share stories about other grassland birds that all of you love as well. But last thing I'm gonna do is just plug a little bit of our upcoming webinars that Missouri River Bird Observatory is hosting. So this is Merbo Science. So if you were really interested in learning more about our field projects and the scientific research that goes into it and what we're finding out over the years, highly recommend you attend that one. So that's next Tuesday. And then the following Tuesday, I'm going to specifically focus on owls and try to share some lesser known facts about owls. Kind of just like maybe quizzing everybody on those like better known facts that tend to get recycled a lot with owls, which are still awesome, but a lot of people maybe already know. So those will be really fun. Also, we have a huge archive of recordings of webinars because we've been doing them since I want to say April of 2020. So there's a lot of great information out there. And so you can visit our website, mrbo.org. And if you click on 2021 webinar series, it'll bring you to a page that looks like this, and you can go on there and register for these webinars. And they should be a lot of fun and you'll learn a lot. So, and there's different kinds of webinars for everything you might be interested in learning. And so that's all I have. Thank you all for listening. I hope you either had fun or learned a little bit of something. And I am happy to answer any questions about anything that I talked about or anything about MRBO you might be curious about. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see each other better again. But thank you all for listening.
Okay, does anybody have any questions for Paige? Raise your hand if you do.
I have one in the chat.
Okay.
That asks, how far do these birds migrate to South America? So I'm not sure, probably talking about the bobolink there. But it's like something crazy, like 12,000 miles. But with the upland sandpiper, I'm not exactly sure how far that is, but a little bit farther even than the bobolink travels. So even farther than that. So quite the distance. And they're not even, the record holder for like longest migration journeys or anything like that. So that's pretty fun.
Any other questions?
Well, I just wanted to ask about the bobolinks. how are they doing these days? And were they ever in greater numbers, or, you know, it's kind of, sometimes it's kind of hard to find them. So does anybody know how they're doing?
I'm not sure I can answer that with any like specificity, but my understanding is like that they are on the decline, like most grassland birds, that their populations have declined. But if anyone else wants to provide more detail of something that they know specifically to bobolinks, feel free to chime in.
Paige, while you answer more questions, I'm going to look up the background for Sarah Kendrick's Missouri Bird Plan, because we went through a whole ranking process based on partners and flight scores and discussed bobolink. But I don't want to start citing things off the top of my head, so I will look that up right now and get back to you.
It's hard to keep them all and to memorize where they all are, but I put a link in the chat for their partners in flight, and from there you can access their database. So that covers all species, where we primarily focus on a couple bird conservation regions and primarily grassland and wetland birds. So we have kind of a modified rank that we get from them that we pull out that's Missouri specific, which Dana's working on now. Just to give you an idea of the kind of attributes that they go into, it's things like threats to them on their wintering ground. So as you mentioned, these birds that go these long distances down to Central and South America. That's why we have efforts in place like the effort Brad Jacobs started, Southern Wings, to try to preserve the habitat on these birds' wintering grounds, even if they're so our Missouri birds we can do all we can to protect them here, but we have to protect them there as well. So threats to wintering grounds would be one thing. Threats on their breeding grounds, that threats during migration, kind of a full life cycle thing. Maybe land use change, those types of things. And then overall trend, which is their overall trends looking at regionally for birds, unlike our local kind of specific things that we look at Merbo. The regional things that community scientists put together through the Breeding Bird Survey or Christmas bird counts gives us an idea of those trends over time, and those are also factored in. I don't know if Dana's
with the bobolink, speaking of the wintering grounds, the problem there is down there, they're known as the rice bird because they are devastating to rice fields, one of their favorite foods. And they have had mass poisonings of bobolinks trying to reduce their deprivation of rice.
I remember hearing a similar thing with the Dickcissels, not necessarily rice, but they'll basically crop dust the large congregations of birds and kill them off in mass. So I don't know if they're as big a threat to the rice fields as the practices on the rice fields are a threat to them.
Boom. Thank you so much for chiming in there, Ethan and Dana. And yeah, I recommend checking out that link. So Ellen asks, with your transects, do you convert to density or just use counts? That's a great question. It sounds like, first, Ellen, you should definitely come to our Merbo Science webinar because it sounds like you'd really enjoy it. But so it's kind of more using density, yes. And like Ethan can maybe get into more details about the analysis of that as well. But kind of using that distance analysis and density is definitely a factor. So no, not just counts, density also, yes.
Yeah, when you're looking at small areas or some of these large conservation areas we look at, we can get density estimates within them and say, okay, we have this many Dickcissels per hectare kind of thing. But it gets really challenging to say, extrapolate across the landscape because the landscape is so variable in Missouri as opposed to the way it is out west. But fortunately, we collect such a preponderance of data out there across a suite of sites that over the time we've been able to start looking at some long-term trends and yearly fluctuations across all the sites that we survey in Missouri. And it's just over 100 sites. And I think our sample size, I don't know if you mentioned it, Paige, but it's like, over 100,000, probably 150,000 at this point.
Lots of data. Lots of data that they've been looking through. Another question. So is Mirbeau doing any work as part of the Audubon grassland initiatives? So yes. So Audubon has that Audubon, what is the specific name of it?
Conservation ranching program.
Yep. And so Mirbeau is a huge part of putting kind of the science behind that term bird-friendly beef. So going out onto the grasslands or the managed ranch lands that project is monitoring and going out there and surveying the birds on those properties and giving that property kind of what we call a bird friendliness score, which is an equation that Ethan and Dana came up with, which is brilliant. And I'll maybe let Ethan describe that if he wants to and whatever you want to add. But yeah, we're a big part of that Audubon conservation ranching program here in Missouri.
Yeah, well, Missouri has a really strong component to that in general, thanks to the Missouri Department of Conservation. And it was actually kind of a brainchild of people in Missouri that really got that thing really going. Then with the help of a former Audubon Chicago guy, Justin Pepper, came down and also helped implement that. And we started it actually in the Flint Hills in Kansas. We started out with our refined protocols that we developed that Paige showed you earlier. And then what we did was we decided, well, we need some sort of metric, you need to, and Mike Leahy of the Missouri Department of Conservation will talk to you about this with grasslands in general. Like we need metrics on the overall community health of these natural communities. So we decided that we could come up with one for birds based on that conservation value scores that come out of Partners in Flight or the refined ones for Missouri. We actually take those numbers for each individual species on a property and multiply it by its density. Then we also throw in a diversity metric. We used a Brilliant for that, not the Shannon Weiner. And we actually come up with a really robust metric for bird friendliness or community health indice for bird populations within the grassland communities for each site. And that's how that works. Well, we established that to give something to Audubon. And as an Audubon chapter yourselves, you should be proud that Mirbeau helped, Missouri helped develop that. And the National Audubon quickly co-opted it as their own. I remember one of the last national conferences we went to, they talked all about their bird friendliness score that they developed. And I actually had to go up to them later and say, you know where you got that from? But yeah, we're proud to do our little thing. That program has put so many thousands of acres on the ground. There's so many people working on it in so many other states. It's really come around pretty well. The most challenging part is building up that consumer base to support that program. We can work on it as hard as we want, but we need to create more public demand for that, understanding the connection between your lifestyle and bird conservation, especially in our grassland communities.
Can you all tell that Ethan is more used to explaining this than I am?
Doing it for like 8 years now, Paige. Don't be hard on yourself.
I'm like, Ethan should just explain this. So yeah, I think that is a really awesome project. Oh, and so Joanna asks, are different types of grazing being addressed? For example, dispersed grazing versus management intensive grazing or mob grazing? For the grassland conservation ranching, I believe the management practices are also being taken into account. I don't know all the details of those different types of grazing. As far as the nest monitoring project that we're doing with patchburn grazing, I don't believe that is the type of grazing is being taken into, like, I'm not really sure what the details are of the land management being done in terms of grazing are on the treatment area. If there's any specific type that's being done, and not necessarily like looking at the different types.
That's a really good question. And it's actually something that's been really, really complicated to try and address. There's a variety of different methods and records kept across all of the different public and private lands that we look at grazing management on. So in the case of the nest monitoring study that Paige described, that is a dovetail with the Department of Conservation's patchburn grazing study, where they're looking at things like impact to streams and stream quality and vegetation. The department is very, very conservative in their application of grazing. And so because, I mean, you all know, you can like quite literally watch the grass grow here in Missouri during most years. Maybe not in our bad drought years, but the rest of the time things get really thick really quickly. So the department has been very careful for a variety of reasons. One, because they want to measure closely. Two, because they don't want to do anything that would harm their properties. And three, because of public opinion, they're not doing anything like mob grazing or even close. So honestly, from the perspective of grassland bird habitat variation and the variety of different vegetation structures that grassland birds need, the amount of cattle that they put on their areas is probably quite low, actually. So it actually makes it really difficult sometimes to accurately assess any differences between the treatment and control units, i.e. where cattle are and where they're not. And in terms of the lands that are involved with the Audubon Conservation Ranching Program, they are managed very, very well. And so we don't have any data right now that show a grazing operation that is managed poorly and like excessively, like with excessive grazing, like you sometimes see, you know, driving down the roads, you'll see things that look like golf courses because it's been overgrazed, right? Those aren't project cooperators. And so we don't have data from really poorly managed grazing lands. So I hope that kind of addressed the question.
Well, that's a good explanation of it. And to look at it another way from the project perspective and how it impacts birds, one of the beauties about it is if somebody wants to enroll that program, they have to prescribe to a management plan that's overseen in Missouri by the Missouri Department of Conservation. So that's always going to be planting natives and creating more ideal conditions for diversity within that area. And our metrics show bird friendliness year to year. And to date, I don't think we've seen bird friendliness scores decline at these sites. More often than not, they actually just keep it continuing to increase until they reach that certain threshold. And that threshold is usually based on area size and landscape.
Any other questions? Nancy, you want to give a plug for the rest of the spring programs, or do you want me to, or?
Go right ahead, Jim.
Okay. Well, next month, February, we have Tim Barksdale. He'll be showing some of his videos. In March, we'll be teaming up with the library to do spring bird migration with our spring birds with Sarah Kendrick. In April, we have Ethan Duke with MRBO doing bird sounds. And in May, if all goes well, we'll have a picnic. So that's the schedule for the rest of the spring. So hope to see you there. Hope to be able to see you live and in person. Anybody have anything else they want to say?
Just like to thank Paige and Dana and Ethan.
We just wanted
Yeah.
to thank you all for all that you do. And what a great, we love getting your newsletters and keeping up to date what Columbia Audubon's up to. You guys are real good leaders and run your operation so well.
Yeah, I just want to say that we recently had a discussion about basically copying you all, because I was like, we have an e-newsletter now and CAS has the chat and it's so cool, and they have a volume number on every newsletter. And so we've been trying to think of a name for our own e-newsletter based on how awesome yours is.
We're willing to take suggestions. I know that River Bluffs already has the Timber Doodle, so.
Okay. Well, again, Paige, Ethan, and Dana, thank you. And if nobody has anything else, oh wait, I just noticed there's one more in the chat. It's just Meredith saying thank you. So, okay, well, let's see you next month then. Bye. Thanks
All right,
again.
bye everybody.
Bye.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
again
coming.
for letting me talk about birds for an hour.